June 1944. The airfield at Recklinghausen, Germany's secret Luftwaffe testing center, shimmered under the summer sun. A low rumble approached from the west, not from a Messerschmitt or Focke-Wulf, but from something foreign, something heavy. The guards at the gate stood aside as a flatbed truck rolled onto the tarmac, carrying a prize unlike any the Luftwaffe had ever captured intact. Painted in deep navy blue, its stubby wings folded upward like the fins of a shark, the F6F Hellcat bore the faint white star of the U.S. Navy, now roughly crossed over with a black Balkenkreuz. Major Hans-Werner Lerche, Luftwaffe test pilot and Recklin's chief evaluator of enemy aircraft, circled the strange machine like an archaeologist, studying an artifact from another civilization. Lerche had flown everything Spitfires, P-47 Thunderbolts, even a B-17, yet this one looked crude. Ein fliegender Amboss, he muttered, a flying anvil. Its fuselage panels were thick, its canopy heavy, its landing gear built as if to survive a crash rather than prevent one. But it wasn't destroyed. The Hellcat had landed itself captured near Salerno after its carrier pilot, Lieutenant Richard Groves, was forced down by flak and rescued by Italian fishermen. The aircraft had been transported north through occupied Italy, meticulously crated, and now stood ready for dissection. The German engineer's notes were dismissive at first glance. Unschön, schwer, unraffiniert, ugly, heavy, unsophisticated. But they were also intrigued. This was a late-production F6F3, with a Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp, the same monstrous radial that powered the American Thunderbolt. When they opened the cowling, the hangar filled with silence. The engine wasn't beautiful, not in the German sense. No polished aluminum or finely fitted seams. Everything was rugged, accessible, modular. Bolts instead of rivets where it didn't matter, hoses color-coded for maintenance, and oil lines, built thicker than anything German mechanics had ever seen. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. It was engineering that screamed not elegance, but survivability. Oberst Karl Bauer, Messerschmitt's chief test pilot, arrived 2 days later from Augsburg. He took one look at the Hellcat and laughed. "No wonder they need so much fuel," he said. "They've built a tank with wings." Yet, when he climbed into the cockpit, he paused. The controls were firm but intuitive. Every gauge was oversized, clearly labeled in plain English. The radio array, massive by Luftwaffe standards, hummed with power. The cockpit heat insulation, the armor plating behind the pilot's seat, the self-sealing tanks, everything hinted at a single American obsession, bringing the pilot home alive. The first flight took place on June 12th. Lerche advanced the throttle, and the double Wasp responded with a low, steady roar, no misfires, no coughing start typical of German radials. The Hellcat rolled longer than a Bf-109 but lifted with steady confidence. Once airborne, its handling was deceptive. It felt ponderous at first, but once leveled, it was stable, unnervingly so. In dives, it remained rock solid, even past 700 kilometers per hour, where most German fighters would begin to shake. Lerche later wrote in his test log, "The aircraft gives the impression of indifference to abuse. It does not care what the pilot does." On landing, Bauer and Lerche stood beside the aircraft, silent. Bauer finally said, "This thing was not built by pilots. It was built by factories that expected their pilots to make mistakes." Recklin's engineers would later discover something that shocked even the most cynical among them. Every part of the Hellcat, from the engine mounts to the wing bolts, was interchangeable. No hand-fitting, no custom machining. Each component could be replaced in minutes with another straight from the crate. It was a principle the German aircraft industry had never achieved, nor believed necessary. In the weeks to come, the Hellcat would not only fly, it would force the Luftwaffe to confront an uncomfortable truth. The Americans weren't winning because they built better pilots. They were winning because they built machines that didn't need perfect ones. By late June 1944, the Hellcat had become Recklin's most popular curiosity. Engineers from Focke-Wulf, Messerschmitt, and Junkers gathered daily around the navy blue machine like priests at a new altar, each trying to understand how something so inelegant could so completely dominate the skies over the Pacific. The question that haunted them was simple. Why was it so heavy? German engineering culture revolved around precision minimalism. Every gram mattered, every surface refined for speed and agility. The Bf-109 was a scalpel-slender, temperamental, lethal in the right hands. The TEMW-190, Kurt Tank's proud creation, was the mechanical embodiment of balance, compact power married to aerodynamic grace. By comparison, the Hellcat looked brutish, its rivets proud, its skin rough, its structure nearly twice as thick. Amerikaner verstehen nichts von Flugzeugbau, one Focke-Wulf engineer scoffed during the first teardown. Americans understand nothing of aircraft design. But as the panels came off, so too did their confidence. The armor plating wasn't an afterthought, it was integrated into the fuselage structure itself, distributing impact forces that would have crumpled lighter designs. The landing gear, oversized to the point of absurdity, could absorb sink rates that would snap a German undercarriage like kindling. Hans-Werner Lerche noted it in his flight report. The aircraft forgives everything. Landing errors, overspeed, steep dives it seems indestructible. In Germany, that sentence carried heresy. Aircraft were meant to perform precisely, not tolerate clumsiness. Luftwaffe doctrine was built around the elite, highly trained pilots, drilled from glider school to gunnery range, men expected to fly machines that demanded perfection. The Hellcat represented the opposite philosophy, an aircraft that assumed mediocrity and survived it. At Recklin's metallurgy lab, the Americans' alloy baffled them. Not the composition aluminum and magnesium like their own, but the consistency. Each sample showed identical properties within minuscule margins. German alloys varied wildly depending on which factory smelted them, the purity of ore, or even the day's fuel mix. The Hellcat's materials told a deeper story. Industrial standardization. Every factory, every worker, every part, interchangeable, repeatable. Oberst Bauer compared it to the German problem of Nachtarbeit rework. Our aircraft are each an individual, he admitted. Theirs are clones. When the engineers reached the engine, the revelation deepened. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 wasn't elegant, it was monumental. Its cylinders were almost agricultural in their simplicity, the ignition system shielded for field repair, the supercharger automatic. To German eyes, used to the fine tolerances of Daimler-Benz engines that required constant calibration, it was crude. But when they tested it, the double wasp ran like a hammer, smooth, constant, and, above all, simple to keep alive. A technician recorded his astonishment in the logbook. Oil leaks tolerated. Timing imperfect. Still no loss of performance. We design for perfection. They design for persistence. Lerche soon understood the tactical logic behind the mass. In mock dogfights against a captured Spitfire Merc De-9s and a Bf-109 G6, the Hellcat could not turn tighter, but it could dive longer, sustain higher speeds, and still pull out cleanly. Where the German fighters quivered near 800 km per hour, the Hellcat sliced through the air unfazed. Its weight became its weapon momentum as armor. That same week, news arrived from France. Allied forces had landed in Normandy. Reports described wave after wave of American bombers and their escort fighters overwhelming the Luftwaffe by sheer numbers. Recklin's engineers looked again at the Hellcat and realized they were studying not just an aircraft, but an industrial doctrine translated into metal. The Luftwaffe had been built on the myth of the exceptional pilot, the knight of the air. The Hellcat proved that the Americans had abolished the need for knights. They had built an air force where durability replaced artistry, logistics replaced heroism, and the weight of machinery itself became a strategy. In that hangar at Rechlin, as the double Wasp ticked down after another flawless flight, Hans-Werner Lerche wrote quietly in his notebook, "They are not fighting the same war as we are. We build instruments, they build systems, and systems do not tire, do not fear, do not break." By mid-July 1944, the captured Hellcat had become a fixture of Rechlin's morning airfield routine. Mechanics in grey overalls fueled it at dawn, its broad wings casting a shadow that seemed to mock the sleeker silhouettes. Parked nearby a 109G, a 190A, even a prototype TAR 152 still awaiting test clearance. When the double Wasp coughed to life, it filled the valley with a deep, blunt rhythm utterly alien to German ears. Hans-Werner Lerche's notes from those days read less like flight logs and more like confessions. The Hellcat, he admitted, was not meant to be graceful, it was meant to endure. The Rechlin trials were designed to strip every aircraft of its legend. Engineers measured acceleration, stall recovery, roll rate, climb time, and energy retention through precise telemetry. No myths survived the stopwatch. For most captured Allied planes, Spitfires, Lightnings, Thunderbolts, the Germans had already established comparative metrics. But the F6F produced a different kind of confusion. The Hellcat's controls were absurdly heavy by German standards. It demanded brute force on the stick during high-speed maneuvers. Yet, to the astonishment of the evaluators, it remained completely stable. At 600 km per hour, where a 109 or 190 began to tremble on the edge of compressibility, the Hellcat tracked like an anvil, slow to turn, but utterly predictable. When Lerche deliberately stalled it at altitude, he braced for the violent wing drop that would have thrown most fighters into a spin. Instead, the Hellcat merely dipped its nose and recovered obediently, as if shrugging off the mistake. He repeated the test at lower altitude, at higher G loads. The same result. His conclusion in the test report was simple but damning: incapable of surprising its pilot. The aircraft's behavior remains logical at all attitudes and power settings. It is impossible to frighten. That line spread quickly through Rechlin's canteen. It was both compliment and condemnation. German fighters rewarded skill and punished weakness. This American brute rewarded mediocrity. It assumed its pilot would make errors and forgave them all. To the Luftwaffe command, that was more terrifying than any performance metric. The Reich could not afford forgiveness. As part of the trials, the engineers ran structural stress tests on the Hellcat's wings. Using hydraulic jacks, they applied increasing loads until the metal began to creak. The F6F's wings absorbed stresses far beyond operational norms, bending rather than breaking. When they finally failed, the fracture pattern showed ductility, not brittleness, the mark of tempered alloys optimized for production tolerances, not laboratory perfection. Dr. Eric Bode, one of the senior materials scientists, reportedly muttered under his breath, "This is not craftsmanship, it is philosophy." Meanwhile, outside the controlled confines of Rechlin, the war was disintegrating. Allied bombers struck Hamburg, Munich, Vienna, names that once carried centuries of culture reduced to black dust. Each raid was escorted by P-51 seconds and P-47 seconds, fighters that, like the Hellcat, embodied the same brutal simplicity of thought. More power, more range, more of everything. When the Americans later captured Rechlin's post-war reports, they were struck by one observation scribbled in the margins of Lerche's notebook. If this aircraft were produced in Germany, it would require 12 times the man-hours. That is the true measure of defeat. Back at the airfield, Lerche flew the Hellcat side by side with a faux 190A8 for comparative trials. The difference in philosophy became visible in the air. The 190 darted and twisted like a fencer, elegant but fragile. The Hellcat simply held course, diving through maneuvers with the weight and certainty of inevitability. In mock gun runs, it was slower to aim, but when on target, it held steady, as if welded to the sky. Watching from the ground, one engineer whispered, half in awe, half in despair, "It does not need a pilot to win. It only needs fuel." By the end of July, Lerche's reports circulated through the Luftwaffe's technical bureau. The conclusion was unavoidable. The Americans were not just outproducing them, they had outthought them. The Hellcat was not an aircraft to be admired. It was a mirror reflecting the collapse of the German belief that victory came from excellence. It was becoming clear that the new war belonged to those who could mass-produce competence, not those who could perfect genius. By August 1944, the war had turned irreversibly against Germany. The Eastern Front bled divisions by the week, the Western Front crumbled under Allied armour, and above it all, the sky, once the domain of the Luftwaffe, belonged to others. Yet in the hangars of Rechlin, the testing continued. The engineers and pilots moved through their routines with the discipline of men who knew the truth but could not say it aloud. Hans-Werner Lerche's daily flight notes on the Hellcat became more reflective, almost philosophical. One entry read, "I used to believe weight was the enemy of flight. Now I see in war, it is survival that decides what can fly." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, like this video, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. That realization came during a series of live-fire trials conducted at Tarnowitz, the Luftwaffe's weapons testing range near the Baltic coast. There, the engineers turned the F6F into a sacrificial subject. They fired 13mm machine guns and 20mm cannons into its fuselage at controlled angles to measure resistance and survivability. The results were unsettling. Where a single 20mm round from an MG 151 would have torn open the thin skin of a 109 or 190, the Hellcat's armour and self-sealing tanks absorbed the impacts with remarkable indifference. Fuel leaks sealed themselves in seconds. Hydraulic lines, protected by redundant routing, continued to function. Even the control cables were doubled, running separate paths through the fuselage. Engine runs, control intact, aircraft repairable, one test report read after the third trial, the holes in the skin covered by chalk marks like scars. Lerche stood beside the wrecked but living machine, staring at it as though it were some indestructible creature dragged from myth. "They've designed an aircraft to be shot and keep fighting," he said quietly. "We build ours to avoid being hit at all." That distinction, avoidance versus endurance, marked the philosophical gulf between the Luftwaffe and the US Navy. German fighters were predatory, built for quick kills in short-range combat. The Hellcat was a carrier-borne tank, meant to fight far from home, over water, with pilots who could not afford fragility. The difference was strategic, not just technical. The Americans had built their doctrine around attrition, accepting loss as a mathematical certainty. The Hellcat embodied that acceptance. Its designers at Grumman even joked that it was built with a little bit of submarine, meaning it could take a hit and come back. German engineers, raised under scarcity and perfectionism, recoiled at that mentality. To them, loss was waste. To the Americans, it was cost. At Tarnowitz, the Hellcat survived every phase of testing that would have rendered a Luftwaffe plane scrap. They even simulated a carrier landing mishap, dropping it hard onto the tarmac from a crane rig, and found only a bent strut. Lerche's own flight afterward confirmed full functionality. In the canteen that evening, a junior engineer named Klaus Ritter asked the question no one wanted to answer. Could we even build this? The room went silent. They all knew the truth. The Hellcat required the kind of material consistency, industrial scale, and logistics network that Germany simply no longer possessed. Its design assumed an empire of factories, not workshops. Its reliability depended not on skill, but on systems that could tolerate human imperfection, something the Reich had never believed in. That night, Lerche wrote one final observation in his notebook. The F6F represents the victory of industry over genius. Its designer was not an artist, but a mathematician of endurance. He understood that weight, when multiplied by millions, becomes destiny. In the months to come, The Hellcat would become the most lethal naval fighter ever built, claiming over 5,000 kills for the loss of barely 200 inches air combat. Lerche would never see those statistics, but he had already grasped their meaning in the silence of the hangar that night. The Americans had turned weight into a weapon not just in metal, but in method. By September 1944, the Rechlin airfield had become quieter. The air raids had forced the engineers to move several test programs underground, and the once busy skies above the Müritz Lake were now patrolled by Allied reconnaissance planes, cameras replacing bombs. Yet within those dimly lit hangars, the captured Hellcat continued to defy every principle the Germans had once held sacred. Its panels were now scattered across long wooden tables, each labelled, weighed, measured, and catalogued. Every rivet, every joint, every wire harness told the same story. Repetition. American manufacturing discipline. The Grumman factory that built this aircraft was less an assembly hall and more an organism, one that had learned to build complexity with the ease of breathing. Lerche walked the rows of parts like an archaeologist studying the remains of a lost civilization. The Hellcat's systems, while unremarkable individually, revealed a pattern when viewed together, an architecture of intention. Every component was slightly overbuilt, slightly redundant, slightly simplified for mass repair. No part trusted the pilot's finesse. Everyone assumed fatigue, stress, and failure. It was, he realized, an aircraft built for the collapse of certainty. The Rechlin metallurgists found something even more unnerving: serial number consistency. The parts were stamped with identical precision, down to a fraction of a millimeter. One engineer compared it to German replacement parts that often required hand-fitting a craftsman's touch that was both pride and weakness. "Even our excellence betrays us," said Oberingenieur Weiss, staring at two identical American brackets that fit together without resistance. "They do not need craftsmanship, they have process." Lerche knew what that meant. It wasn't that the Americans were smarter, they had simply accepted the one truth Germany refused to face, that perfection could never scale. At night, while bombs flickered far to the west, he pored over translated copies of US Navy maintenance manuals that had arrived via intelligence channels. They were astonishingly simple, written not for engineers but for mechanics, describing procedures in clear, redundant steps. Every illustration was bold, every sentence plain. Remove cowl, check hose, if cracked, replace. The manuals were designed for the average man, and that was precisely the point. German manuals, by contrast, were dense with technical jargon, assuming that every crew chief was an engineer, every pilot a test pilot. The Hellcat's instructions assumed the opposite, that any farmhand or factory worker could become competent with the right system. In that realization, Lerche saw the war's outcome in microcosm. "The Americans have democratized skill," he wrote. "We have sanctified it." The next day, during a structural inspection, he noticed something else that made him pause. The control linkages inside the Hellcat were painted with color codes red, blue, yellow, each corresponding to systems: ailerons, flaps, throttle, elevator. To a German engineer, this looked childish, almost insulting. But to a mechanic working under pressure in a dim carrier hangar at sea, those colors meant speed, accuracy, survival. It wasn't beauty. It was clarity. The Luftwaffe's entire aircraft philosophy was collapsing under the weight of this revelation. Germany's machines were artifacts unique, high-performing, and irreplaceable. The Hellcat was infrastructure interchangeable, functional, eternal. When Lerche spoke privately to his friend and fellow test pilot, Hauptmann Alwin Burst, he confessed something that even he seemed ashamed to admit. "If the Americans lose one of these, they build another. If we lose one, we lose a craftsman, a philosophy, a lineage." Burst nodded, his eyes on the dark outline of the F6F resting under a tarpaulin. "They have learned how to make war like a factory," he said. "We still make it like a cathedral." In that moment, Lerche understood that the Hellcat was not simply an aircraft, It was a blueprint for a civilization that had mastered the art of simplification without surrendering effectiveness. A civilization that, in embracing imperfection, had achieved invincibility. He wrote one last line in his log that evening. "The future will not belong to those who build beautifully, but to those who build endlessly." By October 1944, the Luftwaffe's skies had grown strangely quiet. The rumble of engines over the Müritz was rarer now, not because testing had ceased, but because fuel was gone. Rechlin's tanks stood half empty, filled only enough for data that still pretended to matter. Outside the airfield fences, refugees moved along the roads, pushing carts past craters, their faces lit by the occasional glow of a distant city burning. Hans-Werner Lerche still flew the Hellcat twice a week, logging what would become the final series of German tests on the American fighter. Each flight began the same way, a slow, throaty roar of the double wasp shaking the hangar doors, the smell of high-octane fuel mixing with damp autumn air. For a few minutes, it felt like the old days before the war had turned into arithmetic. In one report dated October 14th, Lerche noted that the Hellcat's greatest advantage was not its speed or climb rate, both of which the 490 could match, but its behavior under stress. He recorded how the engine maintained power even after deliberate overheating, how the airframe showed no structural resonance during extended dives, how control response stayed consistent despite heavy loading. "The aircraft carries its own safety within it," he wrote. "It resists exhaustion, it resists time." Those words carried a double meaning. In them, Lerche seemed to describe not just the machine, but the civilization that had built it, a society that treated fatigue as a design factor, not a moral flaw. The Rechlin engineers had begun to talk about the Hellcat in human terms. They called it der Trägerjäger, the carrier fighter, but said it with an odd reverence, as though the plane were a living thing that refused to die. When compared to their own designs, the contrast felt existential. The FUFW 190A9, with its fine-tuned BMW 801 engine, was magnificent, but it demanded perfect conditions, perfect fuel, perfect maintenance. It was a machine built for a nation that no longer existed. In the following weeks, Lerche used the Hellcat in experimental endurance trials. He flew long circuits at 3,000 meters, cutting the throttle and restarting, testing glide characteristics, then pushing into low-level runs to simulate carrier approaches. Each test confirmed what the Americans already knew. The Hellcat could survive anything except neglect. One afternoon, after landing from a particularly rough sortie, Lerche found the left wing's leading edge dented from a bird strike. The damage was minimal, but what surprised him was how easily the repair team patched it. They simply bolted on a replacement section scavenged from spare panels, aligning holes that matched perfectly. "It fits without adjustment," one mechanic said, still bewildered, as if it expected this. That phrase stayed with Lerche, as if it expected this. The Hellcat, he realized, was a physical manifestation of foresight, the acceptance that failure, damage, and chaos were inevitable, and that victory lay not in preventing them, but in preparing for them. Germany, meanwhile, was collapsing precisely because it had never learned that lesson. The Luftwaffe, still designed for triumph, never for attrition. Every aircraft was a gamble, either perfection or destruction. There was no middle ground, no margin for weakness. In November, as Allied bombers reached Berlin's outskirts, Rechlin's engineers began burning their records. Lerche kept his notebook, though, tucking it beneath the floorboards of his quarters. Its final entry from that month read, "The Hellcat teaches us that strength is not the absence of failure, it is the capacity to continue despite it. We built machines that made heroes. They built machines that made survivors." That single sentence, buried in the ruins of a dying air force, was the most honest assessment of Germany's defeat ever written not by a politician or a general, but by a pilot staring at a navy blue fighter designed to win wars by refusing to die. By December 1944, the Rechlin airfield was nearly abandoned. Only a skeleton staff of engineers, mechanics, and a few pilots remained, moving like ghosts among hangars stripped bare of fuel, tools, and hope. The war had come home, and the Reich's industrial heart lay in ash. Yet in one corner, under a tattered tarp, the captured Hellcat waited silent, immaculate, indifferent. Hans-Werner Lerche, now the senior pilot remaining, walked past it each morning with a sense of solemnity he could not explain. Flying it was no longer about data. It was remembrance of what his nation had been, of what it could have achieved, and of what it had lost. The Reich's defeat was not sudden. It was the cumulative effect of decades of belief in genius over system, in artistry over durability, in the exceptional pilot over the reliable machine. The Hellcat, with its 12,275 units produced in 30 months, demonstrated what a nation could do when it organized skill into repeatable performance. The Germans had fought the war like it was a contest of heroism. The Americans fought it like it was a calculation. In mock dogfights over the Müritz, Lerche could simulate the tactical advantages the Luftwaffe had once enjoyed: steep dives, climbing attacks, flanking maneuvers. Against the Hellcat, these tactics were irrelevant. The aircraft shrugged off every maneuver. It absorbed energy and returned it, carried its pilot higher, faster, safer. German pilots could no longer imagine victory against such a machine, not because of courage, not because of skill, but because of the industrial and philosophical gap it represented. Lerche's final report captured this stark truth. The F6F is not merely a fighter, it is a system. Its lethality derives not from individual skill, but from the integration of durability, armament, power, and production. Against it, individual brilliance is impotent. By late December, Allied reconnaissance confirmed that Germany's last operational aircraft were scattered and largely incapable of mass action. The Luftwaffe had become a museum of past excellence planes that could have ruled the skies if fuel, training, and numbers had aligned, now reduced to relics, incapable of surviving against aircraft like the Hellcat. One day, Lerche observed a rare phenomenon. A captured Hellcat, flown gently in a demonstration sortie, executed a maneuver that a Bf-109 or FW-190 could never repeat safely: a steep, high-G dive that ended in a climb with zero loss of stability. It was a performance, born not of aerodynamics alone, but of the sum of every design choice made for survivability, strength, and simplicity. In private, Lerche confessed to his colleague, Hauptmann Burst, "They have shown us the war belongs not to the daring, but to the prepared. The weight we despised is the armor they trusted. The heavy plane is the invincible plane." Even as the Red Army advanced from the east and Allied bombers scarred the west, the lesson of the Hellcat echoed across the dying Reich, that war could no longer be waged on courage alone. Machines, systems, and the industrial capacity to replace them determined the outcome. By February 1945, the Rechlin staff had mostly been evacuated or captured. The Hellcat remained behind, untouched, a symbol of an enemy that had anticipated failure and built resilience into every component. In the silent hangar, it waited as if knowing that it had already won. Lerche's final memorandum, written in a shaky hand, read, "We built for the exceptional, they built for the inevitable. The result is written in the sky, a lesson that Germany has learned too late." In those words, the captured Hellcat became more than a fighter. It became the ultimate testament that technological foresight, industrial discipline, and systemic thinking could render human skill secondary, and that, in war, survivability often outweighs brilliance. March 1945 brought a bitter wind from the northeast, cutting across the empty tarmac at Rechlin. The hangars were half collapsed, the fuel tanks drained to a trickle, and the air was thick with the scent of smoke from distant bombing raids. Outside, columns of refugees shuffled through mud, carrying what little remained of their homes. Inside, the skeleton crew of Luftwaffe engineers and test pilots moved like ghosts among the ruins, their uniforms faded and faces hollow. And in the largest hangar, resting under a torn canvas that offered little protection from the cold, the captured F6F Hellcat, waited, silent, unyielding, almost sentient in its indifference to human despair. Hans-Werner Lerche stood before it that morning, his leather gloves tight against the chill, his breath misting in the pale sunlight. He had flown this aircraft hundreds of times, but never under these conditions, not in a Germany that was crumbling from every side, not in a war that had already been lost in every conceivable way. Today was different. Today he would fly it one last time. The hangar doors were pried open with crowbars, the wind whipping through the skeletal beams and making the canvas shiver like a living thing. Lerche ran his hands over the smooth aluminum of the fuselage, tracing the rivets, the seams, the colour-coded wiring inside the access panels. Each part was a testament to an industrial philosophy he had spent months trying and failing to comprehend. Everything in this machine had a purpose. Nothing had been wasted. Everything had been anticipated. He climbed into the cockpit, the seat firm beneath him, the controls heavy but balanced. As he ran through the pre-flight checklist, a small group of engineers watched from the hangar threshold, their eyes reflecting a mix of awe and resignation. The double Wasp engine roared to life with a blunt, powerful rhythm, a sound that seemed impossibly alive in the stillness of decay. The ground trembled beneath him. He taxied onto the cracked runway, the Hellcat responding with precision, its massive frame betraying none of the fragility of German designs. Lerche lifted off, and for the first few moments he allowed himself to feel something he had not in months control. Power, possibility. The wind tugged at the plane, and it responded as if to say, "I am ready, I am capable, I am indestructible." He climbed to 3,500 meters, circling the sparse treetops around Müritz. The sky, a pale winter grey, stretched endlessly. Lerche reflected on what he had learned during these months of testing. The Hellcat was not merely an aircraft, it was an ideology. Its superiority lay not in brilliance but in consistency. Its genius was in endurance. Its victories were inevitable, not because of individual skill, but because it had been designed to endure errors, abuse, and fatigue to survive when lesser machines and pilots failed. In the distance, he imagined the skies over the Pacific in 1943-44, hundreds of F6F Hellcats stacked like blue walls of steel, energy tactics dictating every movement, pilots following doctrine, the machine following system. He imagined zeros diving, banking, turning beautiful, graceful, hopeless. The mathematics of survival was absolute, and the Americans had mastered it. Germany had never even tried. Lerche executed a steep dive, pushing the aircraft to 450 kilometers per hour, and then pulled into a sharp climb, feeling the wing respond without shudder, the controls heavy but precise. He simulated maneuvers that would have shredded a 109 or 190, tested stall recovery at near maximum angle of attack, rolled into abrupt banking turns that would have torn a German aircraft apart, and the Hellcat shrugged off every challenge. It was in that moment, above the empty forests, that the full weight of Germany's defeat became clear to him. The Luftwaffe had fought with genius, with precision, with artistry, but the Americans had fought with foresight. They had built systems, machines, and industrial processes that were resilient, reproducible, and forgiving of human error. Germany had produced aces. The Americans had produced endurance. The latter would always outlast the former. As he levelled the plane, Lerche felt the last personal lesson of the F6F settle into him. Survival was not a matter of courage or skill alone. It was mathematics, industrial capacity, redundancy, and discipline combined into a single, formidable package. A nation that could produce thousands of these fighters, with trained pilots and maintenance crews, could dominate the skies even, against superior individual skill. He dove again, letting the plane pick up speed, and thought of Rechlin, of Berlin, of Dresden cities that were burning, crumbling, falling under the weight of Allied industrial power. The Hellcat's very existence had been a warning that survival depended not on heroics, but on planning, execution, and the willingness to accept and correct for human frailty. Returning to the airfield, Lerche taxied smoothly onto the cracked runway. The engines slowed, the plane responded without complaint, and he cut the throttle. For a moment, he sat there, in the cockpit, staring at the canvas draped over the hangar beams, the shadows of skeletal rafters, and the few engineers still standing outside. The lesson of the Hellcat had been delivered, even if Germany could not fully act upon it. He shut down the engine, removed his gloves, and unbuckled the harness. Stepping onto the tarmac, he looked up at the aircraft at the embodiment of industrial foresight, durability, and systematic thinking. He thought of the pilots who had flown these machines in the Pacific, the Japanese aces who had learned too late that the F6F was not merely a fighter but a system, a civilization's answer to aerial warfare. For Germany, the lesson was bitter, inescapable, and eternal. The war had been lost not because of lack of courage, skill, or innovation, but because the enemy had built for endurance where they had built for perfection, for system where they had built for artistry. They had brought swords to a gunfight, and the gunfight had already been won before the first shot was fired. Lerche watched the Hellcat taxi back into its hangar, its blue fuselage gleaming even in the grey light of winter. In the stillness, he whispered a final acknowledgement. "You were never meant to be beaten, and we learned that too late." That day, the F6F Hellcat made its last flight over Rechlin. The Reich would fall in months, its skies empty, its pilots scattered, its planes destroyed or abandoned. The Hellcat remained, a silent witness to the ultimate lesson of industrial and technological foresight. It was not beauty that ensured survival, nor genius that guaranteed victory. It was endurance, replication, and the unflinching embrace of the inevitable, the weight of survival, converted into weapon, into triumph. By the time the Americans arrived in May 1945, the Rechlin airfield was a ruin, and the Hellcat sat untouched beneath a tattered canvas, a relic of inevitability, a machine civilization's monument to the triumph of systems over singular skill. For those who had witnessed it, for Lerche and the engineers who survived, the final truth was unavoidable. They had flown it, examined it, tested it, and finally understood that Germany had not lost because it lacked valor or ingenuity. It had lost because it had never built the system to endure what history demanded. The F6F Hellcat was not merely an aircraft. It was proof that the future belonged to those who could make the machine and the nation survive.